Just remember this, a kiss is still a kiss, a sigh is just a sigh. The fundamental things apply as time goes by.
Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of Always Remember, World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. One Tough Gut, the ferocious battles of Monte Cassino and Anzio. Today's episode will focus on the One Tough Gut, as General Mark Clark called the Allied invasion of Italy, which Churchill had said would be the soft underbelly of the Axis. It was anything but. Today we'll look at the invasion of Salerno and the fighting at Sammucro, Monte Cassino, and Anzio. And we'll also hear from James Arness, Gunsmoke's Matt Dillon, who got his $1 million wound at Anzio, and B-29 shot-down pilot Jay DeBoer, who made an incredible escape aboard a German troop train. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes forest, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II, when not only democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters in their reunion newsletters. I soon corresponded with over 140 World War II veterans, including 20 Medal of Honor recipients. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes I taught. So I wrote Always Remember, World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, and launched this series of podcasts to keep my promise. On September 9, 1943, American General Mark W. Clark's Fifth Army began Operation Avalanche, invading the Italian port of Salerno. With Benito Mussolini deposed by the coup, the new Italian government had given an unconditional surrender to General Eisenhower the day before. With the Italian army now terminating all of its hostilities towards the Allies, the German army fought all that much more ferociously, concentrating 8 divisions in the Salerno sector, where they faced just 3 Fifth Army assault divisions. In anticipation of Operation Avalanche's possible heavy casualties, Helen Callentine of Jefferson City, Missouri, was part of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, sent to the 16th Evacuation Hospital in Salerno aboard the British hospital ship the Newfoundland. After a harrowing journey, Callentine barely got there at all. Callentine had joined the U.S. Army Nurse Corps in 1941 and was stationed at an evacuation hospital in Oran, North Africa. From there, Callentine joined other nurses and American Red Cross workers aboard the British hospital ship the Newfoundland as it set sail for Salerno. "The commander said it would be a disaster because the women would need to debark by the rope ladder and that would deter the invasion," Callentine recalled. Well, the GIs couldn't be blamed for being a little distracted by the female nurses, having been separated from their girlfriends back home for months. Unfortunately, most of the nurses and Red Cross workers were never told to change out of their fatigues, helmets, and full field jackets. As a result, Callentine later speculated the hospital ship may have been mistaken by the Germans for a troop train. Mistaken or not, the Germans bombed the Newfoundland, the British ship Callentine was on, at about 5 a.m. "All the medical officers and almost all of the nurses were killed," Callentine recalled. The surviving crew members calmly remained at their posts as they began evacuating the ship. "The first lifeboat carrying senior officers went over the side, but the British seaman had an injured elbow, and he dropped the rope, causing the lifeboat to nosedive into the Mediterranean Sea. Helmets provided some frantic bailing, and the lifeboat sailed off." When Callentine and the other crew members went to their lifeboats, they soon discovered the bomb had blown them away. They had to improvise, and quick. Callentine described, "We went down the rope ladder, and we were rescued by the British hospital ship, the St. Andrew." Eventually, Callentine and the other surviving Army nurses were loaded onto an LCI so they could join the evacuation hospital at Paestum, Italy, about 8 miles south of Naples. Used for amphibious landings, each LCI could transport up to 200 GIs directly to the beachhead. Callentine was not overly impressed. She recalled, "There was nothing but a strong metal rope to keep us on deck, and a good friend to hold on to the boat while you became seasick. We stayed on deck all the time, and we slept under the gun turrets." By the time Callentine finally reached the 16th Evacuation Hospital, she had missed the Salerno invasion by 2 weeks. She would continue to serve the U.S. Army Nurse Corps until 1946. Russell J. Darks of Lebanon, Pennsylvania, served in various roles as a platoon leader, a liaison officer, and as a captain of the 1st Platoon Company C of the 143rd Infantry Regiment. Company C saw 18 months of near-continuous combat from the time they landed at the Bay of Salerno in Italy on September 9, 1943, through their invasion of southern France. Darks landed at Salerno 5 hours after the first wave hit the beachhead at 4 a.m., but the delay didn't make the landing any easier. Darks explained, "By that time, the Germans knew the exact point of our landing, and the 16th German Infantry Division had moved into position, and they were shelling the beach viciously." An executive officer and second in command, one of Darks' duties was to pay the troops. This meant Darks and the rest of the battalion's company executive officers had to drive 25 to 35 miles to the rear to their division, finance, to pick up the payrolls. A typical payroll for the company was $14,000. "We picked up the money, we came back to our units and paid off the troops. Then we returned, left over the monies, which was approximately 50%, because of the men being wounded or killed in action." The whole exercise seemed ludicrous to Darks, and the men were at the front and couldn't spend any money anyhow. The Allied advance came to a halt as the Allies ran up against the German Gustav Line. Running from Italy's east coast to the western coast, the Gustav Line capitalized on Italy's fearsome terrain, along with formidable German defenses such as minefields, barbed wire, and pillboxes, to cut off the Allied advance to Rome. The Gustav Line was fortified by 15 German divisions. In early December 1943, as they pushed towards the Gustav Line, Darks' 1st Battalion was tasked with capturing Mount Sammucro, which had become known as Hill 1205, in a daylight attack with Company C on the left, Company A on the right, and Company C in reserve. The battalion accomplished its initial mission. But late in the afternoon, they were told to launch a night attack down the forward slope of Sammucro to capture the village of San Pietro. As Captain Horton gave his new orders to the platoon leaders assembled at the crest of the mountains, a sharp crack was heard, followed by a light thud. The next thing Darks noticed was that Captain Horton and his 2 lieutenants were all lying on the ground, bleeding profusely from their heads. A German sniper had killed all 3 of them with 1 bullet. Lieutenant Darks was then chosen to lead the 1st Platoon of C Company on a night mission to San Pietro. The Germans had heavily fortified San Pietro with bunkers, pillboxes, and other defenses due to its strategic importance of being on the route from Naples to Rome. Lieutenant Darks was to attack through the area where Company A was presently pinned down by the Germans. To avoid hitting any A Company men, Darks had his platoon fix their bayonets, one of the few times that we attacked with bayonets, and cautioned my men to shoot only if necessary, and only Germans. 20 minutes later, Darks had led his platoon to the crest of Mount Sammucro and had captured 17 Germans without firing a single shot. He remembered, "When they saw us coming with the fixed bayonets, Their hands went up in the air, and they pleaded, "Comrade, comrade!" Mount Sammucro had been secured, but it was bittersweet capturing the German prisoners, knowing one of these 17 was the one that fired that fatal shot that killed 3 of our fine officers of C Company. The anchor of the Gustav Line was considered Monte Cassino, the 1,500-year-old Roman Catholic monastery founded by Saint Benedict. Soaring at 1,693 feet above the Italian town of Cassino, Monte Cassino provided a bird's-eye view of all the main roads and river crossings in the Liri Valley. Because of its strategic importance on the road to Rome, the monastery had been destroyed and rebuilt 4 times throughout its history. One of Roman Catholicism's holiest sites, Monte Cassino, found itself trapped in the most bloody and costly battle of its history, as Allied and Axis forces were mired in a deadly stalemate that dragged on for 4 months, from January 17, 1944 to May 17, 1944. Dark's platoon found itself in mostly defensive positions during the Battle of Monte Cassino and relieved others at the front for some much-needed rest and recuperation. In mid-February 1944, they relieved units of the 34th Infantry Division during bitter fighting. From our positions high in the mountains, we could look across the Liri Valley and see the Monte Cassino Abbey and possibly the southern fringes of the town of Cassino. It was thought that the Monte Cassino Abbey is possibly a German strongpoint. It was decided by higher headquarters to bomb the abbey. We were told the day before the bombing was to take place, which as I recall was the 15th or 16th of February. Again, we had a bird's-eye view of the bombing of the abbey, as wave after wave of bombers dropped their eggs on the abbey and surrounding area. This action didn't seem to alter the course of the war. Despite German guarantees that the soldiers were not bunkered down with the abbey, and after giving the abbey's remaining monks ample warning to evacuate, the Allies had dropped 450 tons of bombs, leveling Monte Cassino for a 5th time in its long history. The bombing did little to stop the German army, which had cleverly hidden itself in the ridges surrounding the abbey and further down the mountain. Once destroyed, the abbey's wreckage of debris, craters, and deep cellars became an impregnable fortress for the German army. Howard K. Fay was in the 34th Infantry Division and was one of the infantrymen that Darks may have seen fighting at Monte Cassino. Fay referred to Cassino as war at its worst, the Verdun of World War II. Only 49 men in my company survived the 15 horrible days trying to isolate the Benedictine monastery at Cassino. American dead covered the mountain slopes. Morale in the 34th Infantry Division was at its lowest ebb at Cassino. Weather-related storms and battlefields covered with dead depressed everyone. Morale was never top-notch because the 34th Division always had some units continually engaged in battle. The only escape from this routine was to be killed or badly wounded. I feel extremely lucky to have survived the Italian campaign. Adding to the misery of the soldiers, blizzards furiously blew through the mountains with strong winds and biting cold temperatures. The weather in Italy throughout 1943 and 1944 was horrible. Seldom did the sun come out, Fay recalled. Weather-related illnesses were rampant among the troops: trench foot, diarrhea, pneumonia, and other stomach ailments. When British troops finally arrived on February 15, 1944, to relieve his company, Fay came down to Monte Cassino with a case of trench foot. I took my shoes off, and I couldn't fit them back on my feet, Fay described. 6 weeks in a hospital followed. It may not have seemed like it, but Fay was one of the lucky ones. At least his trench foot removed him from the endless fighting at Monte Cassino. The battle there raged on until mid-May. After 3 separate assaults ended in deadlock, Monte Cassino fell to the 2nd Polish Corps in the 4th and final assault. Numbering 50,000 soldiers, the Polish corps outnumbered the Germans 3-1. The Allies paid a terrible price for Monte Cassino, with 55,000 casualties, while the Germans suffered only 20,000. In all, some 50,000 men from both sides were killed. The fighting at Monte Cassino had barely begun when the Allies launched Operation Shingle, landing on Anzio Beach in an attempt to circumvent the Gustav Line. The Anzio landings came as a complete surprise to the Germans, who had only 2 battalions in the sector. With little German resistance, the Allies quickly landed some 30,000 men at Anzio and nearby Nettuno beaches within 24 hours. However, U.S. Major General John P. Lucas, commander of the forces, stung by the bloody fighting at Salerno, was convinced that the Germans would mount a furious counterattack. Instead of capitalizing on the element of surprise and the numerical superiority of his forces to push forward off the beaches, cutting off the main supply highways of the Gustav Line, Lucas kept his forces waiting on the beachhead until they could be reinforced with 40,000 more soldiers, tanks, and heavy artillery. The Allies' caution worked to the Germans' advantage, as they rapidly deployed 8 divisions, a total of 40,000 soldiers to the sector, under General Eberhard von Mackensen's command. The Germans also brought with them a fearsome 11-inch caliber railway gun known as Anzo Annie, which struck terror on the GIs as it launched 560-pound shells a distance of 40 miles. The beachhead became an inferno as Anzo Annie and the Luftwaffe's bombardments wreaked havoc. By the time General Lucas finally began his assault on the Italian towns of Cisterna and Capiglione, he was no longer facing sporadic German units, but a formidable 14th Army Hermann Göring Division, which nearly pushed the Allies back to the sea. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was incensed at General Lucas's costly delay, stating, "I had hoped we were hurling a wildcat onto the shore, but all we got was a stranded whale." Edgar L. Kuhlow of Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin, arrived at Anzio about 2 days after the January 22, 1944 invasion. Kuhlow served with the 45th Infantry Division, which had been an Oklahoma National Guard division. As such, the 45th had a number of soldiers of Native American, primarily Apache, ethnicity. Kuhlow described Anzio as a complete stalemate. "We were positioned in these foxholes facing the Germans. The only time we could leave our foxholes was after dark, to bring up water, K-rations, and ammunition. If you got out of your foxhole in the daylight, or even as much as stuck your head out, you got shot at." Because the Germans held the high ground, throughout much of the Battle of Anzio, the Americans were pinned 2 men to a foxhole. The stalemate gave them plenty of time to make their foxholes ever more elaborate, and many GIs covered them with boards they obtained at night from nearby abandoned farmhouses, giving them an extra layer of protection. The Americans were subjected to near constant German artillery shelling, but feared Anzo Annie, mounted on a railway car and kept in a railroad tunnel when not in use, the most. Kuhlow recalled, "Anzo Annie could shoot a distance of some 20 miles. It had a demoralizing whine to it, and you could hear the shells coming for miles." For Kuhlow, not knowing what was going on at Anzio was almost as bad as the fighting itself. "We were told nothing. Our mail was censored, and we were kept completely in the dark," he commented. Kuhlow had no idea of how the battle at Anzio, which went on for months, was going. As with most soldiers, Kuhlow's only reality was his own little sector, and that was it. Pennsylvanian Leo Lawrence was drafted less than 2 months after his 18th birthday on September 1st, 1943. A few short months later, he found himself landing with a 3rd Infantry Division in 120-degree temperature in Casablanca, Morocco. The 3rd Infantry was nicknamed the Notorious Blue and White Devils by the Germans they fought against. The 3rd Infantry counted among its ranks the 1st and 2nd most decorated men in World War II, Audie Murphy and Maurice Lee Footsie Britt, both of whom were Medal of Honor recipients, as well as actor James Arness, Gunsmoke's Matt Dillon. Leo Lawrence and his fellow infantrymen were put on a train through Morocco's Atlas Mountains until they reached Oran, where a British ship transported them to Naples. They arrived there at 1 a.m. and were greeted by German shelling as they left the ship, walking across temporary floating bridges. Lawrence joined the 3rd Infantry at Anzio in the middle of April. The 3rd Infantry had been fighting there since January 1944.
Anzio was my time in hell. No one can ever imagine what it was like unless you were there. There are over 10,000 soldiers buried at Anzio because of an area about 10 square miles that the Germans did not want us to have. It's a wonder how a human body can take the constant sounds of artillery, machine gun bombs, etc., not counting the death that was all over the ground. We lost 900 men dead and wounded on the first day of the breakout at Salerno. History says it was the most casualties of any one unit in one day. It was not a nice day for some of your friends.
10 days after the invasion began in Anzio, Gunsmoke's James Arness received his $1 million wound. He recalled that fateful night in his autobiography. On the night of February 1st, 1944, we were on the front lines and assigned to reconnoiter a certain sector there. With no moon, it was a pitch-black night. There were 3 squads in our platoon, and each had a point man leading the day. I was it for our squad. Our troops were spread out to lessen casualties, should we come under fire. Having been on these dock patrols before, I knew that we developed a sixth sense about where our buddies were as we moved together. As a point man that night, I was probably 40 or 50 feet ahead of my squad. I picked my way over the terrain. Since I couldn't see ahead of me, I never knew whether I'd walk into a big rock or step into a 4-foot ditch. For the first 20 minutes, I didn't hear or see anything. I remember looking down and not being able to see my first step in front of me. Finally, I would just set one foot down slowly to see if the ground was solid, then the other. I felt my way along. It was the same way for the pointmen on either side of me and for the troops following us. We were under strict orders not to speak as we crept along. Except for the night sounds, the air was completely quiet. We were particularly careful not to break a twig, stumble on rocks, or make any noise at all as we stepped through the brush-filled terrain. Most of the farms had small vineyards, maybe 3 rows of grapevines planted 4 feet apart. They'd been trimmed down to a height of about 3 feet for the winter. I was walking through one of them when I heard a voice 50 feet ahead of me, and what seemed like seconds later, a guttural voice yelled, and enemy fire burst out in front of me. I'd walked right into a German machine gun nest. I was hit in the right leg, but I was able to leap over a row of vines anyway, out of the line of fire. Then I fell to the ground. An excruciating pain. It felt like the bones in my lower right leg had been shot all to hell. Intense fire started coming at me from both sides. I was almost killed when a potato masher, a German concussion grenade, went off near me. The explosion literally lifted me off the ground. The Germans had 2 machine gun nests with infantrymen spread out on either side. The firing was low, about 18 inches off the ground, so I had to practically hug the earth not to get hit. There were about 15 Germans. We had 40 riflemen firing and throwing grenades backed up by a light machine gun. The shooting was intense, but eventually our guys overran them and took them out. I don't know how long I laid in the vineyard, but I remember feeling that I was going into shock. In my semi-conscious state, I heard guys coming through the vineyard, checking on our wounded and dead. The point man next to me, Jim Rosen, a soldier I had befriended at Anzio, had been killed, as well as several others. Finally, my platoon reached me. "Where are you hit?" someone said. "In the leg," I answered, but since I couldn't move, I wasn't too sure what other wounds I might have had. Soon a medic arrived. He took a look at my leg and cut the plants open. He inspected the wound and said my leg bones had been severely splintered. Penicillin wasn't used at this point, but sulfa powder did an adequate job of sterilizing the wounds. He poured on some and gave me a shot of morphine, jamming the needle into my stomach since he didn't have time to turn me over and remove all my gear to shoot me in the rear. And then he wrapped the leg with gauze-like material. Before leaving, he said he thought that I had a zone wound. That meant an eventual ticket back to the States for immediate treatment and rehabilitation. Arness walked with a limp the rest of his life, and that wound gave him lots of trouble as when he got onto horses and off horses, and he had multiple surgeries, and with each surgery they oftentimes found pieces of that shrapnel. Jay DeBoer of Sutherland, Virginia, saw action in the campaign to liberate Italy as a B-25 pilot in the skies above her and later on the ground when he was shot down and had to evade capture. DeBoer had always been fascinated with flying. He enlisted in the Army at the age of 18 and was thrilled when he passed the exams for flight training. By age 19, he had begun active duty with the Army Air Corps as a pilot. By February of 1943, DeBoer had begun active duty, piloting a B-25 medium-sized bomber in the campaign to liberate Italy. When DeBoer's B-25 was shot down over the mountains of northern Italy, the 5-man crew was forced to parachute out. DeBoer was separated from the rest of the crew upon landing. That was fortunate for him. 3 of DeBoer's B-25 crew members, Lieutenant Crutchfield, the co-pilot, Flight Officer Brooks, the bombardier, and Charles Regan, the radio man, were quickly captured by German SS troops. Lieutenant Crutchfield and Brooks were both summarily executed by the SS. DeBoer explained,
"The German SS killed many pilots and bombardiers, and I assume Charles Regan survived because he was our radio man and he was not directly responsible for dropping the bombs."
Luck was with DeBoer, who hid from German Nazis for 3 days in the mountains before he was discovered on the 4th day by a priest on a mountain path.
"The priest brought me to a family that hid me overnight, and they furnished me clothing. The priest returned for me the next day, and he took me to his church where I was hidden for the next week."
The priest then turned DeBoer over to an Italian resistance group who promised to help him escape to neutral Switzerland. DeBoer joined 3 other American flyers the Italian resistance had already been aiding. Incredibly, the resistance placed all 4 Americans on a German troop train for approximately 4 hours, equipping them with Italian Army uniforms and telling them to pretend to be deaf mutes. Had their ruse been discovered, DeBoer and the other flyers would have been executed for masquerading as Italian soldiers. Once they were off the train, it took DeBoer and the other 3 flyers 3 weeks of walking, mostly at night, sleeping in barns when they could, to reach the Swiss border. Finally, on March 26, DeBoer and the others crossed into Switzerland, where a black market group turned them over to an American legation. DeBoer was then sent to the 12th Air Force Headquarters and then to his squadron, based on the French island of Corsica in the Mediterranean Sea, before being sent back to the U.S. on April 11th. Active combat was over for DeBoer. He served the rest of the war as a pilot in the Air Transport Command. Although the war didn't dampen his love for flying, DeBoer worked for 30 years as a private pilot after the war. He found himself unable to forgive Germany. He wrote in an April 1996 letter,
"Memories of 51 years ago are not old enough for me to visit Germany."
Rome had been declared an open city by Marshal Pietro Badoglio once Mussolini was deposed in mid-July 1943. By proclaiming Rome a demilitarized zone, the new Italian government hoped to prevent Rome's further destruction by the warring parties. However, neither warring side respected the declaration, as German troops occupied the city in September 1943 and Allied bombs fell once again to dislodge them. Rome was too valuable a strategic prize for Germany and the Allies. Although Prime Minister Churchill demanded Rome fall before the end of 1943, the bitter fighting at Salerno, Anzio, and Cassino stymied the Allied advance. Meanwhile, furious with his former ally, Adolf Hitler ordered bitter reprisals against the Italian civilians. As with elsewhere throughout Europe, the Jews took the brunt of Hitler's reprisals. 1,000 Jews were rounded up from the streets of Rome in October 1943 and sent to the death camp of Auschwitz, where 800 later perished. Ignoring his superiors' orders to move north towards Valmontone, Lieutenant General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army, instead advanced to liberate Rome from the beaches of Anzio. Lieutenant General Clark had decoded German messages indicating that the Germans were withdrawing from the ancient city, convinced that after the bloodshed at Salerno, Monte Cassino and Anzio, the liberation of Rome would give the Allies an important psychological victory just before the D-Day invasions in Normandy. Lieutenant General Clark wanted his Fifth Army to receive the credit for Rome's liberation instead of the British. Clark's intelligence had been correct, and the Germans were indeed withdrawing from the ancient city they had occupied for 9 months to the Gothic Line, their last defensive line against the Allied advance north into southern France. As Allied troops entered the ancient city of Rome, they were greeted by cheering Italians and a grateful Pope Pius XII, thankful that the city had suffered so little damage. Having survived the horror of Anzio, Pennsylvania, Leo Lawrence's 3rd Infantry Division took Rome on June 4, 1944. According to Lawrence, the Italians seemed to flow with whoever was winning the war. Lawrence was relieved to find Rome not severely damaged except on the outskirts where the main roads and railroads and yards were. They got bombed a lot. Lawrence did see a row after row of German fighters and bombers that had been bombed and burned by the American Air Force. Lawrence spent 16 days in Rome. He was gratified to finally get a shower, his first in 5 months. "We did wash as much as you could from our GI 10 helmet," he recalled. Rome was a welcome respite for Lawrence from the constant fighting he had endured at Anzio, but the reprieve didn't last long. The 3rd Infantry Division soon began amphibious training for another planned invasion, this time of southern France. Albert R. Monterazzi of Maryland was recruited to work for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, deep behind enemy lines to foster resistance movements. The OSS was the forerunner of the CIA in World War II. For Monterazzi, it was a great thrill to participate in the celebration of Rome's liberation. The liberation of Rome, along with the imminent Normandy invasions, were hailed by GIs as a sign. "We all felt that soon we'd be going home. Unfortunately, as it turned out, Italy became the forgotten front, and we went through one of the worst winters in Italy's history, and particularly rough for the partisans and our Allied personnel who were there to help them." However, the Germans who pulled out of Rome had made a calculated retreat to their heavily fortified Gothic line across the Apennine Mountains. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had ordered some 15,000 slave laborers to construct the formidable east-to-west line, which included artillery emplacements, observation posts, bunkers, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, and 2,000 machine gun nests. The Germans removed any civilians and leveled all towns, roads, and buildings within 6 miles of the Gothic line, carefully planting minefields in their wake. With Highway 9 running behind it, the German troops who defended the Gothic line were easily resupplied. The seemingly impenetrable line halted the Allied advance to northern Italy for another 10 months until it was finally broken through bitter fighting in April 1945. General Clark was indeed correct. Italy had turned out to be one tough gut indeed. That concludes our 6th episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. I hope you'll join us for the next episode, which will tell the amazing stories of D-Day. Our song today, of course, As Time Goes By, is performed by Adelaide Hall and was made famous in the film Casablanca with Humphrey Bogart. It is one of the signature songs of World War II. It was listed by the American Film Institute as one of the 2 best ranked number 2 in their list of 100 best songs in film. Thank you for joining us. If you like the podcast, please give us a rating. Please follow us. And you can always find the book that this is all based on Amazon.com. Thank you and have a great day.